The idea of an AI system that can figure out how to objectively run the government most effectively without distraction from fallible human emotion is not something that, if implemented in reality, would be as simple as described. In fact, in a way, it's kind of impossible. This is because political judgments, and all judgments actually, are made with a baseline of subjectivity. Take any political value you have and, like an annoying child, ask yourself why you have that belief and keep asking why into infinity. This is also known as the Socratic method. For example, I support gay rights. Why? Because it's important to protect the freedom of individuals to act how they desire as long as it doesn't harm others, and there's not a sufficient amount of credible evidence to suggest that gay men kissing has a negative effect on society. Why do I care about protecting freedom? Because I want people to be unrestricted from chasing what makes them happy. Why? Because happiness is good. Why? I just like freedom. Fuck you. If you ponder hard enough with any political position, you will eventually find that it is based on a belief you can't objectively prove. Freedom is cool. Happiness is good. Suffering is bad. These statements are obvious to a lot of you, but they are subjective judgments. Beliefs we kind of just assume to be true. Beliefs that we can't objectively prove. These baseline values holding up everything else are called axioms. Everyone has them, and they can be found through self-reflecting on the positions you hold. Some are very common, some might be more rare, some broad, and some very specific, but they are all ultimately subjective. Now, it isn't true that there is no objectivity at all. Once axioms are determined, it can be possible to find which policies and positions objectively best follow those axioms. For example, if we start with the axiom, human suffering is bad, then it would be objectively wrong to torture the entire planet. However, to a person with the axiom, human suffering is good and must be maximized, such action is desirable actually, and there's nothing stopping someone from having that axiom. This person is real, and his name is Ron DeSantis. This is the hole at the bottom of politics and ethics, that all of the laws we make for ourselves are ultimately based on a foundation that doesn't exist objectively, one that comes from within, which we don't all agree on. It's true that there are some broad axiomatic values that the vast majority of us can easily agree on, like human life should be protected. However, that isn't enough to base the rules of society on. We have to get into the specifics, and when that happens, we often find that we disagree. For example, we have to define what a human life is, and suddenly, all of this is why I'm glad that Psychopaths has this kind of silly twist involving a silly little room filled with silly little brains. The great lie of the Sybil system is that it is a perfect, impartial system of pure reason, determining how every individual should live to be most happy, or if they are a threat to others, how and when they can be stopped in order to minimize the harm done to other individuals. It keeps up an important facade of unbiased machine logic, but in reality, this objectively perfect system of governing is actually just a lot of brains making subjective judgments and finding a consensus. Our political system is also made of lots of brains making subjective judgments, and all of our laws and administrative systems were created by those brains and all of the brains which came before them, though many of the brains in our world are not nearly as smart as those that make up the Sybil system. This line of thinking is why I tend to distrust anyone who holds up a list of rules on a piece of paper as dogma. When we acknowledge that our judgments are based on subjective fundamentals and that everyone who has ever made a choice has made that choice based on their own subjective fundamentals, we have to also acknowledge that we must be constantly reevaluating ourselves and others to recognize what our fundamental values are, if those values are good, and if the laws we create effectively uphold those values in the current state of affairs. A piece of paper written by even the smartest brains of our day will probably have a lot of things that do not apply to a future society simply because of the advancement of technology, if not the infinite number of other factors that result in the constant evolution of society. Actually, you could probably try to write a list of rules that will apply 1,000 years in the future, but that list would be so small and broad that it wouldn't be effective as an actual societal blueprint. The point is, our political system needs to be flexible to change, because when we refuse to adapt to new problems or ignore problems which already existed, people are hurt. Hot take: our society has problems. Wow. There's a multitude of different ways we could go about addressing said problems, and a lot that needs to be thought over in order to determine the right method of change. Luckily, there's this cool anime that I'm already talking about that offers some pretty important things to ponder, because guess what? Psychopath's Sybil system also has problems. While in many regards this society is an improvement over our current one, the quality of life for most people is great, and the people who fall into the margins do get a little more empathy from the state. Instead of simply waiting for criminals to commit crimes, punishing them, and then refusing to address any of the solvable issues which drive people to crime, the technology of Psychopaths allows the state to evaluate people's mental state with readings such as the hue and crime coefficient, which determines if someone is going to crime, labeling them as a latent criminal. If anyone is getting a bit too silly, the system will, at least in theory, offer them help. Preventative measures are plenty and more common than the reactive and punitive, and thus crime has become almost non-existent. However, there are still many problems with the Sybil system, the main one addressed by the series being that despite the malicious desire to punish criminals having been removed, the label of criminal is still often a self-fulfilling prophecy, and more can be done to help these people instead of just locking them up or turning them into blood balloons. The judgments of the system are wrong sometimes, which becomes even more clear when people trying to destroy society are not flagged as a threat, and the different ways characters address the issues they have with society is a big part of what makes this show so interesting to me. First, we're going to talk about Ginoza, who is actually made interesting in how he doesn't want to challenge the Sybil system. As an inspector in the Public Safety Bureau, he is tasked with dealing with those who the system has concluded are threats to society, arresting or executing if their crime coefficient is high enough. He is completely devoted to Sybil's judgment and actively works to make sure that those around him stay on the path which it sets. As the show goes on, he has this ever-increasing stress threatening his own crime coefficient to reach dangerous levels caused by a number of things, mainly the difficulty of the case at hand, a multitude of events which force him to lose trust in the system, and the fear of becoming a latent criminal. We see then that his persisting devotion to Sybil leads him to restrict his own lifestyle, blocking himself off from things that most people would consider completely normal. Even then, his lifestyle is unable to keep his crime coefficient in check, and as he starts to face more and more evidence that the system he has devoted himself to isn't as perfect as it claims to be, he becomes a latent criminal. One might see Ginoza's story as a warning, or even a tragedy. The system he so devoutly protected and followed was far from perfect, and not worthy of his service. In fact, the system was hurting him the entire time, and the psychological toll of protecting it despite the contradictions and flaws he comes to face eventually leads to him falling from his position of power. He was the most dogmatic perpetrator of the system's evils and a victim of it. He serves as a representation of the idea that being unquestionably loyal is not just bad because of the effects it has on the people the system most directly oppresses, but it also restricts one's own freedom and happiness in a deeply inhuman way. Ignoring the negative effects of the system we live in, refusing to question it or think about what could be better, is self-destructive. Ginoza is contrasted very strongly with his former partner Kogami. Kogami, as an enforcer and latent criminal, is supposed to simply follow the orders of the inspectors above him, but he has a tendency to complete objectives in an unorthodox manner, or even just completely go against what he's supposed to do, which often gets him and the less dogmatic Inspector Tsunemori into trouble with Ginoza. Kogami is not strongly devoted to supporting the system or opposing it. He believes it to be overall just and good, but his main focus is on himself and what he wants, the people directly around him, and what he thinks will most effectively complete what he is assigned. This becomes most clear with his personal mission to carry out justice against Shogo Makishima, this serial murderer terrorist who killed one of Kogami's closest friends. When it later becomes clear that the Sybil system has no intention of killing Makishima, Kogami goes off on his own to do it himself, even if it makes him an enemy of the state. Kogami is driven by his own sense of logic, feelings, and idea of justice, but not really an actual ideology or sense of ethics in relation to the politics of the world. Still, he ends up at odds with the system because its own self-serving motivations end up conflicting with his desires, effectively forcing him into a situation where he either rebels against the system or abandons what he believes is just. Kogami is not a very politically minded person, but his character shows that even those who are fairly apathetic to the system are still affected by its policies, and that it can sometimes get to a point where it's almost natural to rebel against the system. Makishima is the character who most directly challenges the Sybil system and differs from Kogami in having an actual political and philosophical ideology leading his actions. He is driven largely by the value he places on his idea of human freedom, and his worldview, which was shaped greatly by the isolation he felt his entire life from being one of the rare people whose mental state could not be judged by Sybil. His conclusion is to destroy the Sybil system, let society collapse, and give rise to a world where people can truly think for themselves again, and he goes about this mainly through acts of violence which point out flaws and contradictions in the system. Makishima's most significant act of rebellion is his instigation of riots around the city caused by a technology that allows people to commit crimes without their crime coefficient being noticed, followed by counter-rioters taking to the streets to put down these criminals due to the police force's inability to respond. This event also displays how he does things more out of a desire to see a world that is intellectually interesting over improving the material conditions of the people, though his character is still applicable to the real-world idea of revolution. Makishima taps into a feeling that something might be extremely wrong with our society, and that the only way to make it better is through violent revolution and instigation of chaos. This feeling is often exacerbated by social isolation and other deep personal effects of the system on the revolutionary. People who are marginalized by society understandably develop a more negative view of it, and as problems continue to go unaddressed, these people will lose hope that the system will ever help them. Makishima looks at the Sybil system and sees no way for him to meaningfully change it other than through violence and other radical action, because he disagrees with the system's fundamental value of the common good over individual freedom. He sees the heart of the system itself as flawed, and with no clear path for the people to change it through peaceful reform, revolution is the only conclusion. Akane Tsunemori goes into her first day of work as an inspector and is immediately confronted with a major flaw in the system. Victims of crime going through trauma can be flagged for death by Sybil, but also that these people can be talked down to a safer mental state and thus be unflagged for death. Her colleagues Kogami and Ginoza are fully prepared to kill this woman simply because Sybil told them to, but Akane recognizes this for what it is, a gaping hole in the system's logic and facade of objective morality. Not everyone who is a serious threat in the moment needs to die. The system can do more to help people. As the series continues, she is confronted time and time again by Sybil's flaws and overreaches of power, and it's easy to expect her to snap and rebel at some point, but she never does. One of her most important scenes is in episode 11, where she comes face to face with Makishima, having taken one of her best friends hostage. Akane is unable to use her Dominator as the gun is unable to properly read Makishima's crime coefficient, and then he gives her a choice: kill him with this real gun or watch her friend die. Killing Makishima would save her friend, but it would also go against what Sybil had judged to be the right course of action. Akane is unable to bring herself to kill Makishima, and she watches her friend die in front of her. The reason why Akane never fully rebels is not because she is unquestioning like Ginoza. There are plenty of times where she very directly challenges the Sybil system. However, unlike Kogami and Makishima, Akane strongly believes that at its heart, the Sybil system is good for society on an ideological level. The technology and stability available to the vast majority of people in the city is incredible, and she sees the Sybil system as necessary for protecting those things. Additionally, while Sybil treats a lot of the people in ways that Akane disagrees with, she sees the fundamentals of its logic as good. The well-being of some must be sacrificed for the good of the many. Some personal freedom can be sacrificed if it leads to greater happiness, and criminals should be stopped before they harm others or themselves and given treatment. All of this leads her to eventually conclude that she is willing to continue working within the system while also directing herself to make it better. Akane thus represents a kind of middle path between the extremes of Ginoza and Makishima. She wishes to protect the system like Ginoza, but she refuses to take a blind eye towards its flaws. She recognizes that the system must change, but while Makishima sees the fundamental values of the system itself as evil, Akane sees it as flawed but with a good heart, and she learns over the course of the series what she can do to manipulate it from the inside in order to achieve what she believes is the best implementation of its fundamental values. Akane recognizes the flaws of the system as well as the good parts of it. There are aspects of the Sybil system which she disagrees with, and so she does what's in her power to do what she thinks is right. She also has an incredible faith in what the system ideally should be, and so she stands up to overreaches of power with an appeal to the law and decides to uphold the system and follow the law in cases where many people would not. This cast of characters gives key insight into why we must challenge the systems we live under, and the stories of Akane and Makishima specifically show us two different perspectives on how to change things. Makishima is a revolutionary. He sees little opportunity for him to change anything peacefully, no redeeming qualities at the heart of the society, and his idea of a truly free world is something he would like to see himself, so the need for change is urgent and he doesn't mind hurting people to get there. All of these factors make a violent revolution to tear down the current system the logical path to take. take. Akane, meanwhile, wants to preserve the heart of the system and all the good she thinks it has created. The violent path then already doesn't make sense for her, and her personal value of protecting human life and overwhelming optimism don't push her anymore in that direction. Her path is that of reform, to change the system from within it. Now, Psycho-Pass is not necessarily prescriptive. It doesn't say that it is always correct to be a reformist or always correct to be a revolutionary. Instead, it seeks to give us the tools to reflect on the systems and institutions of our world. How possible is it to enact nonviolent change? How urgent is it for us to address the problems which exist? What effects will violent action have on the lives of everyone, and are these effects better or worse than trying to change things slowly? We know that we cannot let society stagnate or regress. Just as us individual people must strive to constantly improve, our societies must also constantly reflect on what problems exist and how we should fix them. And I find that Psycho-Pass is extremely useful and enlightening on determining what actions we must take to make the world better. And maybe most importantly, it reminds us that we cannot simply wait on a bunch of silly brains who we don't know to change society for us. It is people who protect the law, and so it will always be people who must do what we can to change the world. We are the ones who decide our path. I could talk for actual days about all the cool shit in Psycho-Pass, but that's all I wanted to cover this time. Hope you enjoyed this video. I haven't recorded an outro for a while, but I hit 5,000 subscribers, so that's pretty sick. Genuinely, thanks so much for that, and now do all the YouTube stuff and be on the lookout for my next video. Oh my god.